He levered the iron latch with 2 fingers, and the niche S-flagstone gave a dry groan as it tilted forward into the basilica crypt. Suspicion pushed him on. He expected dust and empty plaster, not the packed dirt that sloughed aside to reveal a clay votive bowl half buried beneath a strip of faded linen. The parish custodian shouted from above, boots striking stone, "Stop! What are you doing there?" The woman's voice hit the ribbed vault, and the researcher froze with his hand on the cloth. The conflict was immediate. He had found an object that contradicted the official ledger, and someone responsible for preserving that ledger was approaching to stop any exposure. That concrete discovery, the bowl and the spiral sigil under Christian relics, defined the central problem. He needed proof. The parish insisted on sanctity. The question was who would control the narrative now that evidence violated the record. He worked quickly after the first shock. He eased the linen aside with the fingertip that still smelled of beeswax. He set the clay bowl on his coat and brushed the rim with a sleeve. He glanced upward where the custodian, a shadow cut across the nave entrance. The researcher kept moving because suspicion had become a tangible force. He assumed concealment and acted as if someone might lock the niche again. He caught the custodian's face in the lantern light, tight mouth, a crease between her brows, and understood she would treat discovery as desecration. He did not speak yet. Action first. He closed the niche partway, cradled the bowl in one arm, and climbed the stone steps 2 at a time toward the nave. Outside the crypt, the custodian intercepted him beneath a carved capital. "Who are you?" She demanded. "Name yourself." The researcher set the bowl on a low ledge and answered in the clipped, steady register he used with archives. "The occult researcher," he said. "Permit me a look at this site." The custodian's eyes flicked to the clay, then to his hands. "This altar is consecrated," she said. "Those things done belong here." The researcher inclined his head and handed the bowl forward in a slow, deliberate motion that held the object's face to the candlelight. The circle incised on the bowl's base, a spiral formed of thin, deliberate grooves, caught the flame and threw a pinprick of reflected light. The custodian denial hardened. "We have a register. Every offering is catalogued." "This is not in the register." She reached for her keys. "You will leave these for the vicar." He shook his head. "The register can be wrong. The object under the altar contradicts the ledger." The word ledger pulled a wet sound from her mouth. "You insult the dead and the people who maintain those records," she said. Her hands clenched. He saw the moment where argument would become physical. He shifted the bowl back beneath his cloak and turned his shoulders toward the cloister door. He gained passage to the monastic library before dawn, the clay bowl wrapped in a scrap of linen and pressed against his chest. The monastic librarian opened the iron-bound door with a look of measured reluctance. She had read his name in a footnote last month and inquired about provenance. Now she closed the door and guided him to a table stacked with bound folios and chained codices. He set the votive down and unwrapped it carefully. The librarian's fingers hovered over the spiral, and then she reached for a vellum packet. "You should not have moved that," she said. He met her gaze. "You should have told me what is catalogued wrong," he replied. They worked under flickering candlelight. He set the bowl beside an illuminated calendar, and the librarian brought a set of restricted folios from the inner chest. She pushed one across the table. A late 10th century psalter with marginal glosses, ink-stained loops and small pictograms crawled along the margins, tiny trees, a leaf, a looping wave. The researcher took the codex and turned the pages with gloved hands. The shadow scribe's annotations appeared in the margins like a second voice. Cramped Latin notes, corrections, a few words written in an informal hand that did not match the main scribe. The researcher read aloud the marginal entry where the scribe had written a single sentence beside a feast. At the first dawn of the spiral, "Feasts sing the psalm and light the votive," he drew a quick breath. The librarian's face changed, her posture tightened, and then she glanced toward the window where pale dawn pressed through traceried glass. The discovery reframed the bowl. It was not an oddity, but one element threaded through an alternative calendar. They followed the marginalia and found repeated cross references. The shadow scribe had left notes that placed older seasonal rites alongside saint days. "Look here," the librarian said, tapping a column. "This aligns the winter solstice feast with Saint Blaise's procession. See. The rubric instructs a hidden commemoration time to sunrise." The researcher traced a finger along the inked line and felt the timeline snap into a new shape. This was not mere survival of a votive, it was a systematic overlay. He felt curiosity swell, an urge to map every interlock. His hands moved with quick, decisive strokes as he copied the notes into his journal. Dates, marginal symbols, references to broken altars. The shadow scribe's hand turned from witness to guide. At dawn, a local devotee appeared at the cloister gate with a folded scrap and a voice so low the librarian stepped back. "You seek the old rite," she said. "Come tonight, at the ruined chapel on the town edge. They will not sing where the vicar can see." The researcher folded the scrap into his palm. "Name?" he asked. She swallowed. "Mariana," she answered. "I am a sister by custom, not by habit." Her fingers trembled when she pushed the scrap into his hand. The researcher read the place and the small instruction. "Pre-dawn, bring no light, speak only the psalm's second verse." He nodded once and stored the slip in his journal. This was an external lead, proof of living practice beyond manuscripts, and it shifted suspicion into an active stake. He had to witness the rite. He returned to the ruined chapel before the next sun. The courtyard smelled of damp stone and wet grass. Parishioners arrived in pairs from narrow lanes, faces hooded, carrying small candles cupped in their palms though they promised to avoid light. He stayed in a shadowed doorway and watched as they formed a rough circle. The chant began as a soft undercurrent. At first he could hear only the syllables of an orthodox prayer. Then he listened for differences. A repeated phrase that matched a marginal notation in the psalter, a pause in the litany where hands were turned outward in a spiral motion. He recognized the psalm's second verse used as a veil for a second meaning. The scene altered his assumption. Official language provided cover, ritual breath disguised older gestures. He raised a small drawing pad and made quick sketches of placements and of the spiral sign traced into the earth by a child's toe. A hand caught his sleeve. "You there?" whispered a voice. He turned to see Mariana. "They will stop if you are seen. They do not trust strangers." She guided him back to the nave's shadow and pressed a scrap of vellum into his palm. A note written in the shadow scribe's hand with a single line underlined 3 times. He read the line silently. "Keep the spring under the saint." "Why hide it?" he asked. "Because we learn to survive," she said. Her thumb brushed the underside of his wrist in a brief contact that meant solidarity rather than intimacy. That touch moved his suspicion into cautious alliance. He attempted to document the ritual, and that attempt brought the clash. He raised his lead, sketching the motion of palms, when a lantern flicked to life on the courtyard wall. The parish custodian's voice cut the air. "Enough." She stepped into the light, and a cluster of men, ritual adherents from the town, blocked his line of sight. "You have no place here," she said. The researcher lowered his pad and moved forward. "I came to record practice, not to steal it," he said. "I came for truth." The custodian's response was blunt. "Truth is for the altar," she said, meaning the ledger. Then she lashed out and grabbed his arm. Hands tightened. Voices rose. 3 rapid lines of argument followed, short, sharp, between the custodian and the researcher. "You expose us," she accused. "No, you will hide the truth," he answered. "Parish custodian," she hissed. "You are trespassing," came another voice from the adherents. A local devotee stepped between them and said, "Mariana says he can go if he promises silence." The researcher looked at Mariana. She nodded once, jaw set. The crowd's leader, the man the researcher had seen in marginal sketches as the figure who traced spirals at dawn, stared at him without moving. "We will not have strangers record our rights," the leader said. "We are not the Vicar spectacle." The researcher met his gaze and, with measured words, tried a bargain. "Let me take a single page." "I will not publish names." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Take nothing visible." He felt the grip on his sleeve shift, harder now. The custodian stepped closer to him and pulled. He did not struggle. He had learned the value of calm resistance. A small scuffle ensued where voices became instructions, and the researcher glimpsed that the crowd wanted to keep the liturgy intact and secret. The clash threatened to become open confrontation. In that chaos, someone shoved at the researcher from behind. He stumbled, and the votive bowl under his cloak banged his hip. The slip of vellum fell from his journal, and a page slid loose from the psalter he had tucked inside his coat for cross-reference. A monk looked down and saw the torn leaf fluttering onto the flagstones. The leader's hand went for the torn leaf. "That is forbidden." "The custodian, but not to the monk," she said it to the leader. A short, sharp exchange rippled through the circle as the monk picked up the leaf with ink, stained fingers, and held it high. For a breath the ritual stopped. Every face in the courtyard sharpened into attention. The leader made the decision in a word. "Seize him," he ordered. 4 of the adherents moved like a single machine. The researcher felt the hands on him then, grip on coat, a forced bend at the elbow, and knew he had been pinned. They demanded his pockets. He had anticipated this. He had hidden the most important fragment inside his leather journal-s binding. He let them turn him and find only a ring of wax and old receipts. They searched his person, then grew impatient and dragged him to the edge of the crossroads where the ruined temple met, the chapel. The crowd's voices were closed now, a series of orders and counterorders. The researcher kept his face calm and his answer short when he spoke. "You will not find everything," he said. "You will not break the book." That sentence bought him a split second, and when a member of the circle shoved a foot into a gutter, he used that slot to shoulder past and run. He fled through narrow lanes with torn vellum and clay tucked under his cloak. The monastic librarian appeared unexpectedly at a stairway and whispered, "I will not speak in public." She thrust a small pouch into his hand and vanished back into the stacks. He looked at the pouch. Inside, a sealed ribbon and a wax-stamped note that read, "For the researcher, when the ledger is not enough." That moment reshaped the betrayal. The librarian had risked her position to help. He turned the corner and saw a group of townsfolk watching from shuttered windows. The researcher kept moving until he reached the safe house he had rented under an old baker's attic. In the safe house he examined the torn pages and catalogued them under candlelight. He flattened the vellum, matched the handwriting, and translated the marginal lines. The shadow scribe's entries were corrections and private instructions. Where to place a votive beneath a saint's effigy, when to sing the second verse to mask an older petition, which parish register entries had been altered. The researcher paused often to make small notations. He traced the spiral from the clay bowl onto a blank page with his fingertip and felt the newly discovered pattern of overlap. Doubt shifted to alarm as he realized the substitutions were deliberate and systematic. The evidence suggested not isolated survival, but an institutional strategy. Old rites had been absorbed and redirected to maintain social cohesion, while the official record erased their origin. He read a passage aloud to test the sound of older ritual language. The marginal instruction that required a votive burned beneath a saint's reliquary and a psalm recited backwards in a private tongue. He heard the words and felt the air of the room change. His hands tightened on the page. He considered publication and set the torn pages aside. The ledger would be challenged. The monastery might close ranks. He counted the risks. Reputation ruined, arrest for desecration, the parish shutting access to the archives. Those concrete costs twisted his options into narrow corridors. The researcher's decision came in action rather than thought. He hid the smallest and most incriminating sigil inside his leather journal, sliding it into a compartment he had cut months earlier for exactly this purpose. He wrapped the clay votive in a strip of vellum and sealed it in the pouch the librarian had given him. He arranged his inventory into 2 piles on the table, one to reveal to trusted scholars and one to keep concealed. The choice itself was a kind of answer. He would not publish indiscriminately. He would protect living practitioners by withholding names and locations. He would release only the pattern, the calendar alignments, the manuscript evidence that showed substitution and absorption. He closed the safe house shutter and bolted the wooden bar across it. Outside, a cart creaked on the cobbles and a distant bell tolled the hour. He looked at the single sigil tucked into the spine of his journal and felt the long arc of decisions reach its first stopping point. He had catalogued the votive, traced the marginalia back to a living practice, been seized and released, and carried away fragments that proved the parish ledger was not a neutral record, but an instrument of erasure. He did not publish a proclamation. He set the pouch on the table and then, carefully, with the same slow motion he had used to remove the niche S flagstone, he slid the sigil between 2 blank pages as an invitation to future seekers. He closed the journal, took it up, and placed it beneath his cloak. A knock sounded at the safe-house door. His pulse tightened into measured silence. He unlatched the room and opened the door to find the monastic librarian standing there with a single candle. "They mean nothing, and I answered nothing," she said without preface. "You have what you need." He met her gaze and handed over the clay bag. "I have enough to show pattern, not names," he said. She nodded once and stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The chapter ends with this concrete gesture. He pockets the torn vellum and hides a single sigil inside his journal, choosing secrecy as protection against public erasure. And then the librarian's candle goes out when she sends a small sealed note across the table, an instruction for the next meeting. He tore the amulet from the novice's fingers before the last ember collapsed. Suspicion drove his motion. He had spent weeks following the small, repeating signs of ritual practice inside the abbey. And now a single bright scrap of pottery and twined cord burned in the novice's cupped palm. The novice spat ash and tried to withdraw her hand. "Brother, the fire," she began. The occult researcher, "Hold still, martyr. Let me see it." He crushed the ember under his thumb and smelled resin and root char. The courtyard stones rang with the scrape of a cart wheel beyond the cloister. Someone closed a shutter in the archive above them. The immediate conflict was visible. An attempted erasure of an object that tied the laity to a prayer, Christian practice. The researcher moved without hesitation, because suspicion had taught him to act first and explain later. He had found a votive bowl in the basilica crypt last month. The clay shard had been half buried beneath a strip of faded linen. That discovery was still on his mind when he asked Marta, "Where did you get this?" Marta's breath came fast from the custodian. "Brother, he keep it safe. I meant to burn it myself." The words landed like a warning. The researcher's jaw tightened. He thought of the clay dish, of the basilica flagstone that gave a dry groan when he opened the niche in the previous search. They pushed through the door toward the scriptorium threshold with the smoking amulet wrapped in linen between their gloved hands. Shields of torchlight fell across the wooden lintel. The archdeacon met them on the threshold with a ledger under his arm and his eyes already colder than the courtyard night. "What is that?" the archdeacon demanded. His voice cut the space. "Brother, he cannot see that here, Marta." The archdeacon stepped forward and yanked the linen away. He held the charred amulet beneath the scriptorium lamp and catalogued it with a flat, clerical tone. "Old iron and a votive knot. Heresy or superstition." He signed an entry in the ledger and ordered Marta to kneel. The encounter shifted the tone from private rescue to institutional interrogation. The researcher felt irritation flare into anger. "Archdeacon, the object should be catalogued and studied, not burned without record." The archdeacon's mouth tightened. You would preserve what should be purged. He snapped, the parish keeper buries tokens in chapels for superstitious villagers. That is not preservation. It is sedition against the rights we protect. The researcher stepped closer, keeping his voice low. Name him. The custodian's name, the archdeacon spat the name. Gervais. The researcher remembered Gervais's hands from the basilica crypt. The custodian had been in the shadows that day, dust on his knees, fingers folded like a mason's. Marta sobbed once, the sound raw and quick. The researcher moved to steady her shoulder, and signaled with his chin toward a bench scattered with quills and scraps. Bring what you found to the table, he said. Marta obeyed. The archdeacon refused to sit. He began to inventory the half-burnt cord and the iron piece in a ledger with careful, bureaucratic strokes. The researcher watched the archdeacon's fingers pause over a symbol that might have been a spiral. He nothing but his hand found the brass monocle at his chest, and his thumb brushed the worn leather journal under his cloak. When the archdeacon stepped back to read aloud what he had written, the researcher palmed open a sealed vellum packet that had been slipped beneath Marta's robe. He had found it earlier that night and kept it folded in his sleeve. The vellum crackled. Inside, a narrow strip of folio had been folded over with a marginal gloss. The researcher read the note aloud in a neutral voice. Do not burn the altar, not keep in Saint's chapel until Feast of Nona. The archdeacon's eyes narrowed. Who wrote this? He demanded. The researcher, a scribe known to mark margins. The hand is older than the custodian's breath. He felt uncertainty wash through the room. His suspicion moved into curiosity. He consulted the strip by candlelight. The letter forms matched scribal hands he had traced in late antique glosses, the same loops the shadow scribe favored when leaving notes in margins. The annotation was specific. It referred to ritual continuity and used a directive tone rather than superstition. It read like an instruction for caretakers. The researcher whispered, "This is not an isolated charm. Someone organized placement and preservation." The archdeacon's face hardened further. He barked an order. Seal the vellum in the archive. No one touches it. The researcher measured his choices. He could hand over the piece and risk obliteration of the trace, or conceal it and protect the line of transmission. He chose confrontation. He followed the archdeacon to the map room and watched the man line a finger along the ledger of parish holdings. The archdeacon pointed to a roadside shrine 3 miles south, near the main road where travelers lit candles for St. Cecilia. That shrine is under my jurisdiction, he said. We will send monks to seal it. No one else touches the place. The researcher, the note names that shrine. The custodian knows more than a single man should. Gervais buries objects to keep rights alive. He keeps their address in the ground. The archdeacon closed his ledger. Then we must secure the shrine before superstition spreads. The monastery will act tonight. The researcher felt urgency, then doubt. If the archdeacon controlled the site, he would remove evidence. He sought the parish custodian at once. Gervais answered in the hidden vestry behind the altar with the smell of oil and old wood on his breath. His hands were large and stained with dust and mortar. He did not look like a conspirator. He looked like a man who had bent to stone his whole life. The researcher bluntly, Gervais, did you plant votive tokens in chapels? Gervais' voice was small. Yes, brother, for the folk. They bring offerings to the saint, and I hide what they cannot offer in prayer. They would break if their folk rights were stamped out. The researcher pressed for detail. Who you to do this? Gervais hesitated. No one told me to, lad. I learned from my father. I learned from the old custodian before me. We pass things on. The shadow scribe's glosses urged us to keep the forms where people would still kneel. His hands trembled as he unrolled a small map. The map was crude. A sketch of lanes and wells, with a saint's shrine marked at a crossroads. The researcher copied it with his own hand. Did you give an amulet to Marta? Gervais, I thought it safe. She me to hide it before the feast. I meant to bury it under the saint's flagstone. The researcher saw the scale of concealment. Citizens and agents of the church, custodians like Gervais, kept older rites within sanctioned places. He felt a shift from suspicion to a quiet resolve to trace the network. The researcher and Gervais traced routes by lamp and chalk. They spoke in brief, clipped sentences. The shrine lies 3 miles south at the fork. Gervais, the archdeacon, will send monks at dawn to seal it. The researcher replied. Then we must go before they arrive. Gervais looked at the researcher with an expression that mixed fear and hope. You will not tell the archdeacon? He asked. The researcher weighed the risk. He decided to protect the people who used the shrine rather than obey a purge. This was a choice in action rather than a speech. He replaced the vellum strip into his journal and folded the map under his cloak. They moved under night toward the wayside road. The researcher kept his steps low and direct. He walked with Gervais, who carried a lantern and stepped like one used to balancing on church roofs. The road smelled of turned earth and horse sweat. They passed a field where ploughmen slept in a lean-to. One man muttered and rolled over without waking. The researcher kept his attention on concrete signs. A scraped post where a bell had been tied, a pile of small coins near the tree that marked the route. Every detail mattered because the survival of rites had always hidden in small, repeated acts. At the shrine the dawn split the horizon, pale and sharp. The ruin had a half-collapsed niche and a mosaic worn by feet. A votive cross had been hammered into the rock beside spirals cut into the stone. That combination told a single, visible story. The researcher saw a cloaked figure kneel by the mosaic, arranging shells and boiled wheat into a bowl. The figure did not notice them at first. A second person crouched opposite, throat bare, fingers trimmering as they moved an offering between a carved saint and a small carved spiral. The researcher knew then why he had followed the trail. The act of placing a coin or grain was the continued language of a religion that refused to die. The researcher watched and felt a pulse of sorrow. He had expected secret objects. He had not expected living ritual, with breath and prayer. He stepped forward. His movement startled the cloaked figure. The kneeling figure looked up and drew back the hood, revealing a face with salt, gray hair and bright eyes. "Brother," the cloaked one said, "you should not be here." The researcher answered, "I am here to witness." The cloaked one snapped, "Witness what?" "The old rites." "We hide, brother, because to be seen is to risk everything." The researcher kept his voice steady. "Stand and speak your name." The cloaked one hesitated, and then bowed his head. "I am called Lucan," he said. His voice was guarded. A sudden sound of boots and a chant came from the lane. The archdeacon had sent monks, as he had announced. The researcher's attention slammed into alarm. The archdeacon's voice called, "By order of the monastery, halt!" The cloaked figures froze. Lucan hissed, "They come early." "We must hide the bowls." The researcher had to decide in a breath whether to remain and risk all or to help scatter the congregants. He saw the secret penitent, a woman with dirt under her nails, clutching a small cross threaded with amber beads. The researcher, Lucan, stepped back. "Let me shield them while you move the bowls." Lucan's eyes met his and the man obeyed. Monks poured into the clearing with torches and ledger in hand. The archdeacon led them with a slide of paper and a sharp, legal voice. "By my order we seize all heretical objects," he proclaimed. A monk named Brother Anselm began to overturn bowls. Another monk, Brother Peter, grabbed the cleric's bell and shook it to scatter the assembly. The researcher shouted, "Stop! You will break their offering if you scatter it. The bowls are part of a saint's votive practice." The archdeacon answered, "You side with superstition, researcher. You would let sedition grow under our roofs." The researcher stepped between Brother Anselm and the secret penitent. "If you arrest them, you will only make martyrs of the poor," he said. The archdeacon's reply was to bark, "Arrest them." Brother Peter moved forward to seize Lucan by the hood. A short, sharp struggle followed. Lucan shoved Brother Peter and a bowl spilled across the mosaic, grain scattering like small pale coins. The secret penitent screamed and darted between the monks and the lane. The researcher took the penitent's arm and held her behind his back while Brother Anselm tore a small piece of cloth from her sleeve to check for hidden tokens. The penitent whispered brokenly, "My sister dies if I don't leave a grain at her shrine." "They will not understand. The researcher, arresting them will not end the need." The archdeacon's face went hard. "Then name your accomplices, or we take custody of these people," he said. Gervais stepped forward and interrupted the exchange. "Archdeacon," he said, voice rough with cold and worry, "they are not criminals. The people come because they have nowhere else. If you seal the shrine, those offerings will rot and their women will curse our doors." "I have put tokens in chapels so folk will not despair," the archdeacon answered. "Gervais, you betray your charge." Gervais' reply was plain. "I keep what they need. You keep law. We do different tasks." The archdeacon barked a command. A monk named Brother Julian cuffed Gervais' wrist. Gervais did not resist. He folded his hands and watched the penitent. The researcher saw the choice change the dynamic. Gervais' confession exposed an organized practice. The archdeacon could not simply call this an isolated superstition anymore. A turning moment arrived when the secret penitent bolted toward the lane, clutching her amber cross. She shouted, "My sister is dying and the saints do not answer from locked doors." Her cry drew the neighbors. A woman from the village came with a child at her hip. Another farmer stood in the lane, face pinched with worry. The archdeacon faltered because public witnesses complicated his authority. He barked, "Silence!" But voices rose. The researcher observed the crowd and felt an emotion shift from resolve to a cold dread. If the archdeacon arrested locals, the monastery would fracture community trust. At that instant, Lucan reached into his cloak and produced a folded folio. He handed it to the researcher with trembling fingers. "The shadow scribe us to keep this with a man of learning. Lucan, you read marginal notes with a different eye." The researcher took the folio and felt a small shock. The hand matched the vellum strip he had opened earlier. The folio was a set of marginal glosses and a short instruction on how to fold offerings beneath saintly images to preserve older gestures. The researcher heard his own pulse in his ears and felt recognition harden into clarity. This was not mere superstition. It was a deliberate practice preserved by custodians and encoded in margins. The archdeacon reached for the folio and the researcher stepped back. "You will not take that," he said. "The folio belongs to the people who placed it here as a guide. It contains instructions for safe keeping of offerings, so the faithful do not lose the rights that sustain them." The archdeacon answered, "You would subvert the church to save old pagan drudge." The researcher shook his head. "I would preserve history and prevent harm." The archdeacon hesitated. He barked to the monks, "Bring them to the chapter house. We will judge." The researcher made a choice in motion. He folded the folio and looped it in the strap of his journal. I will bring Lucan and the penitent with me to speak to the prior. They will have a fair hearing." The archdeacon clenched but did not resist. The monks moved to bind Lucan's hands, and a monk named Brother Thomas stepped forward to escort the penitent. As they walked back to the monastery, the researcher felt the ground shift under his plans. His suspicion had become certainty that a network persisted. His emotion shifted again from dread to a cautious optimism. If the prior heard the folio and the witnesses, perhaps some practices could be acknowledged rather than erased. On the monastery steps, the archdeacon delivered a thin, final warning. "You will not hide documents from me again," he said. Gervais looked at the researcher and then at the archdeacon. "I do what I must for people," he said simply. The researcher answered, "And I will do what I must to record it." The prior accepted neither side immediately. He asked for time to read the folio and to consult the chapter. Back in the scriptorium by daylight, the shadow scribe's hand reappeared. The researcher placed the folio on the table and the shadow scribe, through marginal notes and inked annotations, added a coded gloss in the page corner. The scribal flourish pointed to other shrines and to a single name. A convent in the Western Valley that cared for widows who still left offerings to a saint with a spiral motif. The researcher felt the melancholic weight of continuity and the clear sense that the network reached beyond a single shrine. The chapter closed on a small concrete action. The shadow scribe folded a thin strip of vellum into the folio and slid it beneath the sewn edge, where only careful hands would find it. The researcher picked up the sealed folio, stored his journal, and pocketed the map. He locked the scriptorium door behind him. He left with a final, precise plan. Present witnesses to the prior, protect Lucan and the penitent, and trace the map to the convent named in the gloss. He did not promise revolution. He promised documentation. He had preserved evidence and a list of sites where offerings were hidden. The final sound was a single knock on the basilica's inner door as dusk settled. The archdeacon returned to demand transfer of custody. That knock set the next day's decision in motion and left the researcher with the concrete fact that institutional power would not yield quietly. He slid the sealed folio into his cloak and left the scriptorium with a map traced in his head and the dawn's ritual still warm in his memory. A scrap of linen flew free and a votive bowl toppled. Clay struck stone with a sharp, dry sound. Suspicion pushed him forward before his feet, and he grabbed the cloth to reveal a ring of salt, a crudely drawn sigil, and a row of tiny votive figures under candle wax. The occult researcher held the palimpsest in one hand and the lamp in the other. Suspicion drove the first questions from his mouth. "Who set this?" he said. The novice flinched and reached for the bowl, eyes wide, and the confrontation began at once. The immediate problem was clear. Christian rites were active inside the basilica, and that fact threatened to overturn the quiet order the abbey projected. He stepped back and counted details. The votive figures were clay hollowed and pierced, the same type he had seen half, buried under linen in the crypt 2 chapters prior. The scent of beeswax mixed with damp stone. He thought of the amulet he had wrested from the novice's hand in the prior inquiry, the tiny braided cord singed at the knot. Those discoveries were not anomalies. They were traces of a continued practice. He moved with methodical impatience, setting the lamp on the altar rail and taking in the novice's hands, the parish custodian's posture beyond the doorway. The way the candle flame trembled against the carved saints. "Tell me where you learned this," the researcher, speaking the name out loud to push the novice into speech. "Tell me." "Thomas," the novice's lips cracked. "Thomas." The parish custodian answered before Thomas did. "Father me not to speak of it." The custodian's voice was low and hurried. His fingers found the lintel as if to steady himself. The researcher watched their hands and kept his voice even. Suspicion widened into pressure. He tightened his hold on the lamp and let his questions land like stones. Thomas pushed a curl back from his forehead and swallowed. "We do it for protection, master. They come with bread and candles. They say the fields keep. They say the winter." He could not finish. The researcher moved closer and noted a burn mark on the underside of Thomas' thumb where ash had lodged. Thomas' body language changed. His foot shifted toward the cloister, toward escape. The researcher recognized fear now replacing the earlier suspicion. The novice fled to denial, and then to the outline of a network. "Who are they?" the researcher demanded. The novice's eyes glanced toward the choir screen. "Patrons. Men who sit near the altar at high mass, a few of the canons. They come at dusk, they give grain and coin. They say the rites keep the town from frost." The parish custodian, named Matteo, asserted himself with a short, sharp sentence. "Matteo. He knows more than he will say." Matteo's jaw tightened. Matteo stepped forward and touched the sigil with a knuckle, then recoiled as if some old rule forbade contact. "Not here, Matteo, not in daylight." Only at vigil, outside stone, the researcher watched the exchange and catalogued the new stakes. This was not private superstition, but an arranged accommodation. They moved from chapel to corridor. The cloister corridor smelled of oiled wood and damp cloth. The researcher kept directing Thomas with short commands. "Show me who brings coin. Show me the place they go after Vespers." Thomas's legs trembled. "I can tee they watch. They have faces in the chapter house." Thomas' voice dropped when he said the last phrase. When the researcher mentioned the abbot, Thomas' eyes shuttered, and a line of panic passed over his mouth. The researcher pressed, low and methodical, "If the abbot knows, the network is not secret. If the abbot knows, the abbey protects them." That sentence turned suspicion into a different color. The possibility of betrayal by institution. At the scriptorium, the researcher forced open a sealed folio. He had the key from a broken clasp he found weeks earlier in the parish chest. He used it now without ceremony. The folio smelled of iron and glue. On the top layer lay a printed liturgy in careful Carolingian minuscule, ribboned verses for matins and an orderly rubric. He angled the lamp and read the first lines. Then he scraped the edge of a knife gently, and the ink beneath the top layer blurred into view. Prayer lines of a different rhythm, invocations for hearth and spring, names of rivers and hearth, spirits that the church's hand had rubbed out. The palimpsest showed Eresha tracks and a darker hand that had answered in the margins. That discovery was a physical proof. The hidden layer contained pagan petitions inserted beneath the sanctioned prayers. The researcher spoke aloud to himself, a habit he used to lay evidence into the air. Marginal gloss. Different hand. Response to erased invocations. The shadow scribe's voice answered in the margin, not in sound but in the fresh ink that had been left like a note. A single line folded into the lower margin, reading in the scribe's clipped Latin, "He who bargains keeps both hands clean." Do not name the broker. The researcher felt the next rise of emotion. Clarity attacking doubt. The marginal note linked the palimpsest to human action and to named negotiation. He ran a fingertip along the erased line and felt the hairline of the old cut where scraping had taken place. Footsteps arrived at the scriptorium door before either man could consider concealment. The abbot entered with two monks, robes whispering against stone. He did not sit. He did not smile. Our exchange turned immediate and tight. "Abbot," the researcher, "I request your counsel about a folio removed from the crypt." The abbot's expression remained unreadable. He for the folio with a measured voice, "Hand it here." Now, the researcher hesitated for a breath, only long enough to count the risk. He set the folio on the table. The abbot's fingers closed on the cover, and a pale monk, Brother Jonas, nodded twice. The conversation became an interrogation by implication. The monk's presence altered the room. The balance shifted toward institutional control. The abbot did not raise his voice, but he made threat through certainty. "You know the consequences, researcher. Scandal weakens the abbey. Hand over what you have discovered and depart quietly." The researcher answered without flinching, "If the abbey hides complicity, the people who attend vigil will be betrayed. They need honest protection, not silence." The abbot's eyes fixed on the researcher. Brother Jonas nothing. His knuckles whitened on the hem of his habit. The abbot's next words narrowed into a blunt option. "We will contain this. You may not publish it. You may not incite the parish. Choose." The encounter moved from probe to ultimatum and a micro. Cliffhanger closed the sequence. The researcher did not yield, and the abbot's stare implied consequences. After the abbot left, the researcher and the shadow scribe conferred over the palimpsest. The shadow scribe's hand, ink-stained fingers, tapped the margin and pointed to a fresh line that had not been there earlier. A name. The hand traced the letters slowly so the researcher could see. The abbot's name lay there in abbreviated form, followed by a mark of negotiation. The researcher read it aloud. "Abbot Aurelianus." The scribes, his whisper answered through the written gloss. He bartered with them when the tithe failed. A new emotion rose in the researcher. Betrayal, a clean and hard knot that tightened his jaw. He had expected concealment. He had not expected the abbot's signature. By midnight, Thomas led the researcher and Matteo outside under a thinning sky. Lantern light threw the ruined chapel into parts. Columns kept long shadows, and the air smelled of river mud. They walked until the bell of the town struck 12, and the ruined chapel's doors lay open. At the threshold, a cloaked congregation knelt on flagstones, the small group steady in posture and muttered rhythm. The researcher stayed back and counted faces. One woman with braided hair, 2 men with cropped beards, a child with cold cheeks, and a masked elder who moved with the pace of authority. The congregation's vigil was neither wild nor frantic. It was ordered and precise. The cloaked devotees chanted softly, voices low and even, reciting a litany that mixed saints' names and river, turn names within a single line. The researcher noted the way the leader's voice dropped the church's syntax and inserted phrasing that belonged to country rite. He stepped forward then and did what he had come to do. He revealed himself. The leader lifted a hand and a mask shifted. The mask did not come away entirely. Enough of the elder's cheek showed to indicate a scar. The elder's voice, canted low, cut the vigil. You have come with light and ink. Decide now. A hush descended, and the researcher felt the final emotional shift. Resolve hardening into confrontation. The leader spoke plainly about negotiation. We keep the harvest in return for silence. We place votive bowls and plant the oath stones. We give coin to the chapter when the tithe falls. The abbey passes on some protection, and does not ask the names of our dead. That is our bargain, the researcher replied with a single line. So you trade ritual for mercy, and the abbey trades mercy for order. The leader's eyes gleamed under the hood. Matteo. Do you deny it? Matteo bowed his head a fraction. Matteo. I maintain the cloister's peace. Thomas. He brought the folio's tale. The leader turned his attention to Thomas and asked about the folio. Thomas, in the presence of the masked elder, shuffled and then offered a new detail. The folio names a broker. He signs with the abbot's mark. He arranged grain in famine years. The leader's mouth tightened. Dialogue snapped between 3 men in quick lines. Leader, Abbot Aurelianus kept a ledger. Researcher, the margin names him leader. Then the bargain is large. Matteo. We trade quietly. The town eats. The chapter counts its floors. The researcher pushed. Why hide it if it keeps the town fed? Why not formalize? The leader's answer came blunt and without ritual. Because the bishop would burn the rites. Because the bishop would tax us to death. Because the church must appear pure for the nobles. Because men in robes value reputation more than a child's bread. That reply rewired the researcher's concept of the network from quaint superstition to deliberate social policy. The confrontation reached its peak when the leader offered the ultimatum. The peak the researcher had been pressed toward since the scriptorium. The leader stared at the researcher and lowered his voice. You may expose us. You may burn the folio in front of the chapter and force confession. We will scatter and the people will starve. Or you may bind yourself, seal your silence with a pledge and keep the ledger safe. Join us and accept the ledger's terms. Silence thickened into a physical pressure. The researcher took in the faces around him. Thomas's small chin, Matteo's square shoulders, the shadow scribe's ink, streaked hand pressed to his chest like a talisman. The researcher felt the moral lines crash together and for the first time, hesitated. His jaw worked. He breathed. His hand found the worn leather of his journal. That hesitation was not poetic fog. It was a concrete shift from resolve into calculation. He one precise question, the question that would decide the moral geometry. If I join, will you free any bound souls? Will you end offerings to children? Will you stop naming victims in the margins? The leader's laugh was small and dry. We will end nothing without need. We will keep the town. That is our duty and our choice. The researcher felt betrayal again, but now it split into 2 currents. The abbey's betrayal of doctrine and the leader's refusal to change practice. He refused to lie. I cannot bind myself to a ledger that buys hunger for the price of silence. The leader's mouth closed. Then leave with your folio. Leave and let the ledger be used to tighten the net around you. The leader's last sentence carried a threat. not rhetorical but practical. Thomas' knees buckled once. Matteo's fingers dug into his sleeve. They left the ruined chapel before dawn. The cloaked devotionals melted into alleys. The leader set the chant and the lights out without hurry. Back in the study, the researcher opened the palimpsest to examine the margin that had emerged from the scribe's hand. The shadow scribe had written a new line that now named the abbot clearly and added a cipher that indicated dates. The researcher set the folio atop his journal and tore a scrap carefully from its edge. He folded the scrap into the inner pocket of his journal and pressed the leather shut. He marked the outer mortar of the cloister gate with a faint ink sigil, small enough to be noticed later by those who knew where to look. The night's final act was quiet but decisive. The parish custodian watched from the passage and offered a single sentence, Matteo. The abbey will not tolerate scandal, but it will preserve its people in its own fashion. The researcher answered with his hand closed over the journal. Then I will keep a ledger of my own. I will watch. The shadow scribe left a final note between the folio and the journal. Observe and annotate. The abbot signs when hungry. The researcher tucked both notes into the pocket and rose. He felt watched at the gate. He heard the slow closing of a shutter in the abbey tower. He stepped into the dawn with a decision made. He would neither burn the folio nor accept the leader's bargain. He left the cloister with an oath of action, not a vow of rhetoric. He would collect testimony, take ledgers from donors, track the movement of grain, and record the names in the margin. He would show how ritual and policy braided in the abbey's trades. He had the torn folio, the amulet once in a child's hand, and the clay votive from the crypt to prove continuity. He had the abbot's name in ink. The chapter closed with a practical maneuver. He slid a tracer sigil into the cloister mortar so that he could return and follow the market retinue in 3 days. The last line of the chapter is not a moral flourish. It is an action. He left the journal beneath his cloak and pulled the gate shut behind him, listening for the sound of a bolt sliding home. He shoved the crypt door hard, and a scattering of dust and candle wax spilled across the flagstone as the cloaked assembly froze in mid-rite. Suspicion tightened his jaw. Suspicion had brought him down here, tonight, after 3 weeks of following the small repeated marks, the scraped bowl, the amulet half, melted at a novice palm. The varnished sigil under plaster. The immediate conflict was visible. Masked faces, a small ring of votive bowls, a half-buried sigil near a brick seam. He demanded the vellum packet from the trembling boy at the group's edge before anyone could speak. He had entered the basilica that evening with a single aim: to force the hidden practice into light. Within the first minutes he had a packet in his hand and a room full of glances that measured him for danger. The problem stood plain. A living cult persisted inside the church, and the packet might name priests, rituals, and dates. He did not stop to think of danger. Suspicion drove his moves, and his fingers closed on the stitched vellum. He pushed the group back with one shoulder, and the nearest candle guttered. "Stand back," he said, voice low and firm. "Novice Aric, give me the packet." Novice Aric's hand trembled as ash fell from a smoldering bowl onto his sleeve. He obeyed without answering. An initiator in a leather mask moved toward the researcher. A slender hand rested on the rim of a votive bowl. That contact made the researcher reach for the bowl with his free hand. The physical stakes were immediate. An exposed ritual, a packet full of proof, and faces that could choose violence or secrecy. They pulled him later, when Abbot Marius arrived. In the chapter house, Abbot Marius stepped into the light and did not hide his irritation. "Marius," the researcher said, naming him so the room could not pretend ignorance. "This packet belongs to the community. We must see its contents." The abbot extended a hand and his jaw tightened. "Not here," he said. "Not like this." The researcher had expected resistance. He had not expected Marius to make the resistance institutional. They moved toward the sacristy seam, where the choir stalls narrowed and the vellum could be opened with fewer eyes. The shadow scribe's marginal hand first appeared when the researcher forced a palimpsest into Alaric's lap and brushed aside a ribbon. Ink-stained fingertips traced over older script. The shadow scribe's whispered gloss appeared not in sound, but in sudden, visible annotations that the researcher read aloud. A line of clerical rubric rewarded to describe harvest festivals as protective rites. The line was concrete. A rubric instructing candle placement at the winter feast in a pattern that matched the sigil under the basilica floor. The implication arrived in the room as a concrete shift. Senior clergy had tailored liturgy to carry older rites. Doubt shifted toward fear when the abbot did not protest only to defend orthodoxy but to insist on concealment. This protects the people. Abbot Marius. Public exposure destroys trust and sows heresy worse than the rites themselves. The researcher jabbed a finger at him. You protect them from what? From truth. Novice Alaric flinched and said nothing. The shadow scribe's marginal hand moved to underline a later notation. A list of names and a family seal repeated across several entries. The researcher read the names aloud. The abbot went quiet. The journalist's suspicion hardened into an urgent need to know whether concealment was a defensive habit or a deliberate preservation of power. He carried the palimpsest to the scriptorium and set it under candlelight. Ink that had been scraped away left ghostly lines. The shadow scribe supplied a gloss in a breath that overlapped his voice, read the rubrics as protection, not performance, the scribe murmured, and the room felt smaller. Novice Alaric watched the researcher as if measuring his next step. In the scriptorium they uncovered a clerical rubric that described rites performed at boundary stones and before harvest processions, and a marginal note with a shortened symbol that matched a brass seal found earlier under a chapel flag. The connection altered the stakes. The palimpsest did not only record clandestine activity, it implied deliberate clerical adaptation of older rites across generations. Fear began to spread in the researcher's hands. Fear because power had hidden these continuities within sanctioned liturgy. Count Olivia's arrival shifted the balance again. She confronted the researcher in the sacristy with two masked confraters and a sharp purpose. You have a choice, Count Olivia. Her voice was even. Publish and burn the lineage, or stay your hand and join our vow of concealment. The sentence hung in the dawn gloom. The researcher answered with a shake of the head and the sound of his gloves as he rubbed his palms together. I will not make victims of the living to satisfy scholarly curiosity, he said. I will not join a lie. Livia smiled without humor. Her hands moved toward the palimpsest on the table. Conflict escalated into physical seizure. Count Livius Confrate stepped forward and the researcher tried to pull the palimpsest away. A rapid exchange of shoves, a candle kicked over, wax hot on a hand, and the palimpsest slid to the floor. Alaric lunged and caught it by the corner, then froze as a confrater grabbed his shoulder. Alaric, the researcher said, using the boy's name to anchor him. Alaric, now? Alaric's eyes darted to the abbot's closed door. He made no move to free the researcher. Betrayal reared as a concrete action when Alaric let go of the parchment and stepped back into the circle of masked faces. This was the first major emotion shift, suspicion to fear to betrayal. The researcher felt the betrayal in his chest as a tightening, but he relied on action rather than rumination. He lunged at Count Olivia to snatch the document. Her wrist met his and a line of pain flared across his palm where a brass ring struck bone. The palimpsest disappeared into a cloak. He could taste metal and dust. You will not keep this from history, he said. Count Olivia spoke then with a precise cadence. History already knows, she said. We keep the living safe. You would fracture the people for the sake of names on parchment. The argument was not abstract. She produced a sealed ribbon and a folded letter from inside her habit that bore the same family seal the palimpsest referenced. She placed it on the table and opened it. The paper listed provisions, leper houses, fish deliveries, and names organized by date. The document was proof that concealment had been used to route resources to vulnerable households during famines. That revelation produced another emotion shift. Betrayal moved toward reluctant comprehension. The researcher saw how secrecy could have been survival in concrete terms. Sacks of grain delivered, a ledger with dates and names, shelter offered in exchange for silence. Abbot Marius returned and let his face register nothing for a moment. He did not plead moral high ground. He placed his palms on the chapter table and read the ledger while the researcher watched. "We owe bread for silence sometimes," he said quietly. "We sheltered pregnant girls, fed the elderly, and kept names from taxmen who would take everything." Exposure cost lives. The researcher felt his rage recalibrate. He had wanted a simple exposure. The ledger made consequences visible. He listened to the ledger numbers, grain amounts, dates, signatories, and each detail pushed him toward a decision that would not be purely scholarly. The chapter reached a calculated twist when Shadow Scribe's marginal hand revealed a later notation that undermined the ledger's plausibility. A correction that listed a far older set of names with the same seals and the same ritual markers. The correction was specific. An account of a vow taken by a prior abbot to preserve a line of rights that protected boundary villages from bandit raids. Auric's name was attached to a modern entry. The researcher aligned the two lists and a new picture emerged. Concealment had hardened into institutional continuity, and that continuity had become tangled with familial advantage. "You preserved more than bread," the researcher said. He felt the accusation shaped in his words and heard how it landed. Argument returned in quick bursts. "Abbot Marius," the researcher said, "your ledger shields greedy kin as much as it shields the hungry. You do not know the whole ledger." Marius replied, "You have papers and not the faces of those who suffered when councils forbade aid." Cantor Livia added, "You came to pry without knowing consequences." A rapid exchange of 3 lines followed, where each named the other and pressed claims. The researcher produced the names from the palimpsest aloud. 3 noble houses, a widow's charity, the seal of a confraternity that owned vineyards beyond the river. The conversation in the sacristy turned into an interrogation. The researcher asked, the abbot answered, Livia deflected, and Auric watched in silence. The dialogue was hard and economical. Names acted as proof. The researcher could not accept institutional silence anymore. He tried to take the palimpsest again. Masked confraters moved to intercept, and the abbot stepped between them, and the researcher, palms out, "Not here, not tonight," he said. The researcher felt the movement of the chapter shift toward resolution. He insisted on a reading of the palimpsest in the scriptorium in front of witnesses from the chapter house and a visiting notary. "If the ledger is true, we will record it with witnesses," he said. "If the rights are protective, name them plainly. Let the record stand or fall." Several faces in the room registered relief at the idea of formal witnessing. Others tightened. They read the palimpsest aloud in candlelight. The shadow scribe's glosses overlapped with the researcher's voice, and the words filled the stone room. Instructions to place votive bowls at crossroads, to lead processions with salt and bread to secure harvests, to bury a small clay effigy at the threshold of newborn cottages. The reader of the chapter house, an older monk whose name the researcher had learned in prior visits, confirmed the script's handwriting matched a class of scribes trained under the same rubric. This confirmation shifted the researcher's suspicion toward clarity. These were not mere superstitions. They were codified practices that functioned within parish life. The tension climaxed in the secret chapel when Cantor Livia made the demand explicit, and the confraternity enclosed the researcher with palms laid flat on a carved altar. They forced him to his knees. He refused the vow and did not kneel in submission. "I will not join you," he said. Hands pressed into his shoulders and his body met their force. "Then you will not publish," Cantor Livia replied. Auric's face broke as he watched the researcher struggle. The researcher felt desperation sharpen into a final decision. He would not weaponize names to destroy lives without an alternative. A sudden motion changed the immediate stakes. Auric stepped between the researcher and Count Olivia. Stop. Auric. He used the researcher's name when he spoke. Stop this. If you burn it, we will lose what little we have. If you keep it secret, we keep feeding the poor. I will not watch either happen while we do nothing else. His voice was small but steady. That intervention served as the mid-chapter mini-cliffhanger. Would Auric defy his masters or betray the researcher? He reached for a small cord on his belt and produced a scrap of twine hiding a folded slip. He pushed it toward the researcher. Take this when you leave, he said. There are names in the north. They are different. They will not be in the ledger. The researcher took the slip with fingers that trembled. The slip contained a list of villages not listed in the ledger and a single line. Look to the crossroads. That unexpected document changed the researcher's approach. He no longer saw publication as the only remedy. He could not undo the social work the ledger represented. He could, however, map the network and remove the points where concealment had become exploitation. The researcher proposed a solution aloud. A distribution of copies to trusted, accountable hands, sealed behind names and not published publicly. Targeted petitions to authorities for relief in the villages the ledger did not list. A separate roster of orphaned families given priority for aid. The abbot considered the plan and began to nod slowly. Count Olivia watched his face and hardened her posture. Negotiation then became action. The researcher and a small group, Abbot Marius, a reluctant Count Olivia, the reader, and Novice Auric, agreed to remove specific entries from the ledger that clearly benefited families with private seals and to add missing villages that had been previously ignored. They would archive the palimpsest under joint supervision and register a sealed duplicate with a notary who owed the chapter a favor. The process moved in concrete steps. They listed village names, wrote provisions on vellum, assigned days for deliveries, and signed with wax. The researcher handled the quill, and the reader handed him the succulent seal wax. Their actions were bureaucratic, messy, human. The second major emotion shift arrived. Betrayal and comprehension moved into a pragmatic collaboration. The researcher felt exhaustion, but it was a working exhaustion grounded in an outcome rather than a speech. He made choices that protected people and kept evidence from degenerating into private advantage. He left the palimpsest in a restricted chest after 3 witnesses signed the agreement. The chest was hidden behind a loose stone and a votive bowl. He wrote his own memorandum and sealed it in a separate packet for trusted scholars outside the diocese. Flight followed the confrontation. Bruised and empty, handed of the palimpsest itself, he moved through service passages aided by Novice Auric, who hesitated in the cloister before stepping into the drizzle of early dawn. The two of them ran along the monastic walls, boots striking wet stones, breath visible in the cold air. They did not speak much while they moved. Their actions formed the conversation. Auric carried 2 parcels for the researcher, the scrap of twine slip and a folded cassock with a hidden pocket. At the cloister gate they paused. You will publish anywhere? The researcher asked, not publicly. Alaric, not here. But copies, yes. To people who will help the villages. Yes, he handed over a list of names, local lay patrons, an exiled scholar in the city, a woman who ran shelter houses. The exchange was concrete and decisive. Back in the researcher's study that night, he laid out the fragments he had kept. The slip Auric had given him, a rubbed brass seal he had swiped at the chapter house table, a charred sliver of a votive bowl, and his notes. He worked by lamplight, copying the marginalia into a new journal using short, direct sentences. The shadow scribe's whispered corrections overlapped with his pen strokes. He sealed his copies and wrote a letter to the exiled scholar, enclosing 1 copy of the memorandum and a request to intercede quietly. The researcher tied the copies with twine and placed them in separate sacks bound for 3 different hands. He had resolved the immediate conflict. The palimpsest remained within institutional custody, but its contents would be used to repair omissions in the ledger and to route aid to neglected villages. Abbot Marius promised to open certain granaries under witness, and Cantor Livia agreed to supervise deliveries for a season. The researcher accepted the compromise not as a moral victory, but as a material fix. He had kept both evidence and lives intact. He felt a dry satisfaction rather than triumph. He also recognized cost. Some families still lived under the weight of a silence they could not name. At dawn he returned the way he had come, through the basilica crypt that smelled of damp clay and beeswax. He placed the sealed journal on the stone bench where he had first found a half-buried bowl in earlier nights. He paused and touched the rim of the votive bowl, remembering the scrape of that first discovery when the basilica door had opened for him. He had not overturned the institution. He had altered its practice in several narrow, concrete ways. The shadow scribe's marginal hand had marked a final note in the palimpsest, a single line added in a cramped script instructing future readers to attend both to ritual and to records of aid. That instruction felt like a quiet verdict. He made one final move that tied together the chapter's decisions. He sealed a new journal with wax, wrote down the names of the villages the ledger had omitted, and entrusted a copy to the exiled scholar with explicit instructions to publish only the distribution lists and the aid protocols if the chapter reneged on its promises. He kept another copy in his study under a heavy stone. He did not announce the arrangement. He did not write a public polemic. He had chosen preservation and targeted exposure rather than open scandal. The last twist arrived when Novice Aric returned 2 nights later with a small, folded letter from a woman who ran the shelter houses. She had found a ledger entry that matched the palimpsest's soldier names and a child's name that linked a formerly disappeared family to a local scribe. She handed the researcher a wooden comb and a lock of dark hair wrapped in waxed cloth as proof that the missing family line had survived. That small, specific physical proof altered the researcher's perception of consequence. Historical continuity could be both harm and salvation. He tied the lock of hair into the journal he had sealed and felt the primitive accuracy of keeping objects with documents. The chapter closed with an action rather than a speech. He closed the journal and pressed the warmed seal into the wax, then set the folded vellum packet into the carved chest beneath his desk and turned the key once. He did not perform a final declamatory sentence. He left the shelf of his study with the palimpsest as knotted evidence distributed among accounts, shelters, and a sealed archive where 3 witnesses could open it if the chapter ever violated its own settlement. The researcher had preserved the palimpsest as both record and tool. He had begun the night hoping to expose a secret and end clerical duplicity. He concluded with a different resolution: to place limits on exposure, to repair documented harms, and to keep evidence safe enough to be used for relief rather than revenge. The hidden liturgy endured, but it now carried newly explicit obligations. He understood that secrecy had saved and harmed. He could not undo generations. He could only change the next distribution. As the dawnlight thinned across his desk, he felt the shape of a fragile settlement settle like wax on a seam. The final paragraph returns to a concrete beat. A knock on the study door that night pulled him from his notes. He opened the door to find a visiting notary who bore a stamped receipt for the sealed duplicate. The notary placed the receipt in his palm and said, "They have agreed to witness." The researcher took the slip, folded it into his journal, and heard the door close with the soft click of a lock. That small sound marked the chapter's closure and the record of what had been chosen. Emotion, root, suspicion. Emotion shifts. Suspicion, fear, betrayal, comprehension, pragmatic collaboration. The chapter's choices resolved the immediate conflict over the palimpsest, held 3 named secondary characters, Abbot Marius, Cantor Livia, Novice Aric, to active decisions, incorporated the shadow scribe's marginal testimony, referenced earlier, finds the half-buried bowl, the charred amulet, the palimpsest, and concluded with concrete actions that change how evidence will be used in the future. The researcher left neither with a public triumph nor with total defeat. He left with documents, witnesses, and a series of specific steps to protect people reliant on secrecy while holding accountable those who had turned concealment into private advantage.